Welcome to NAIS Member Voices. I'm Scott Donaldson, Member Engagement Director at the National Association of Independent Schools. This month, Jackie Wolking speaks with Spencer Burrows, Equity and Civic Engagement Coordinator at the Pacific Ridge School in Carlsbad, California. Spencer shares how he's been making civics real for students through hands-on experiences like internships, advocacy trips, and direct engagement with local government. He discusses the creation of the Civic Leadership Academy, the importance of focusing on local issues to foster meaningful participation, and the development of essential soft skills like communication and adaptability through the program. Spencer also offers practical advice for schools looking to build or enhance their own civic engagement initiatives, all while navigating today's polarized climate. Here's Jackie.
Thanks, Scott. Spencer, welcome to Member Voices.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Before we jump into the details about some specific programming, I'd love if you could give us some context about Pacific Ridge as a school community, and then more specifically, how the equity and civic engagement work looks across the school community on any given day.
Absolutely. So Pacific Ridge School is a 6th through 12th grade school in North San Diego County in the city of Carlsbad. And so the equity and civic engagement work, and maybe I should back up a tiny bit. This is my third year in the role. And the role really came about 3 years ago, looking towards the upcoming 2024 election. And our school had a desire for more intentional programming around the election itself, but also civics more generally. So beginning the year prior to the election, I got some of the civics work off the ground with our students. And the original intention, especially in an off-election year, was to provide civics programming for all the different grade levels. And as you can imagine, that looks different depending on the age we're talking about. So working closely with our middle school leaders, middle school staff, we created some intentional programming, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and each one was given a different focus. And so the 6th grade focused on local government, 7th on state, 8th on federal. And the hope was that was going to dovetail well into the curriculum that they already had built in. So it kind of complemented what they were already doing. At the time I was teaching government, so I was having my juniors and seniors teach these different modules to the middle school students, which was a great opportunity for them, not only to expand on what we were learning in government class, but also display some leadership and public speaking skills and getting in front of the middle school students, pushing that forward. At the high school level, same kind of setup. We tried focusing local government for 9th grade, state for 10th, and then federal for 11th and 12th. And so if that was more of the direct civics instruction, my big push and my desire kind of moving this program forward was getting the students meaningfully engaged in the civic process. And aside from election years where maybe there's some more obvious ways to be involved, I really wanted our students involved in local civics, state civics. And a point that I'm going to keep coming back to repeatedly is I'm a big proponent of having these kinds of programs focus on local government. And the reason for that is students can have the most tangible impact on their local community. And not to go too far in a tangent, but maybe we were going to touch on this later anyways, I think students often get frustrated looking at something like national politics, that it's big and expansive. And I think their impact is just by law of numbers less felt. And that can be frustrating when you're trying to push something forward or advocate for an issue and you just don't see any effect. Versus you are going to have an effect on your local community. And there's always opportunities, I think, to really be involved in meaningful ways. So throughout all this, I was really trying to direct our students towards that. So I assume we're going to talk in a little bit about some of those specific activities. But to your point about equity, the equity tie-in here is expanding access to the civic process for all students, regardless of socioeconomic status, race, religion, so on and so forth, but making sure that everyone had their voice heard and that they all had access to these different touch points. And especially when it comes to interacting with actual elected officials, an opportunity many students and young people don't have. I wanted to provide our students with that access.
Yeah. Can you go a little more in depth, were you teaching each of these grade levels and it was like part of your programming to design and deliver? Or did you have to work more broadly across the school with lots of different divisions and educators to kind of push this work forward?
So I teach 11th and 12th graders primarily. This year I'm teaching AP, US government and politics. In other years I've taught econ, US history, and at the time government. So expanding all the way school-wide on this level was really me partnering with those other grades and grade levels, and both on the leadership end and the individual teachers. So this required not only our school does a lot of really great collaborative teaching, whether it be teaching teams or grade level teams. That's something that we're used to doing kind of as a function. But as I mentioned before, I was really hoping to not make civics just a one-off, like a thing that happens on the side, or we talk about it once and then move on. I wanted this to be embedded in what the grades were already doing and hopefully enhance the different programs that they had carrying forward. So for example, 8th grade focuses on American history kind of broadly. So part of their study is civics on kind of a broad level. So we made some intentional touch points to, for example, set up a field trip down to the San Diego courts downtown, where the students got to meet with the judge, see the actual courtrooms, do their own mock trial, and kind of learn about that civics end in depth, would set them up well for, they take a spring trip to DC, where obviously they cover a lot of the federal issues and meet with our federal officials. 6th and 7th grade is a little more malleable because they cover kind of different areas in broad strokes, but maybe not as an obvious civics connection. So I also serve as a commissioner in our city of Carlsbad city government as a planning commissioner. So I was able to arrange our 6th grade to go to Carlsbad City Hall to meet with 2 of our council members and see the premises and talk with them about some local issues, which I thought was an appropriate and intangible touch point for the 6th grade. So all that just to say, finding these different touch points. This year, the middle school is looking at the Tijuana River crisis as an issue, which has become more and more not only a local and even county issue, but now a federal issue that our federal officials are getting involved. And so taking that on as an issue where you can learn about the science and in their science classes, but then also the more civics and social science and what elected officials are actually trying to do to address the issue. And we're actually going to be working with our U.S. Senators, Adam Schiff and Alex Padilla. Their offices are going to partner with our students to talk about solutions, advocacy, and kind of that end.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a really integrated approach. I think for myself, having been a teacher, what I love about what I'm hearing you say is that it's also something that you're using as like what the teachers were already going to cover in their classrooms and really making that strong connection to both equity and that civics piece that is like so important, that it's not just one more thing on a teacher's plate to cover, but it's really that integrated approach and kind of building off of what they were already doing. So I think that's exciting. I'm wondering, you mentioned that a focus on the local government is really where you can see the most tangible impacts. I'm wondering, can you share a few examples? I know you have already, but any others that come to mind across the grade levels that you'd really like to highlight from your experience at the school and working across 6 through 12?
Sure. So our local youth have seen more and more of an issue with e-bike riding. And I realize that this is an issue faced by a number of local communities kind of across the country. But the issue is we have ages 10 through 18 riding on e-bikes throughout the city. And as some of the residents will claim, like some fairly unsafely, it's becoming more and more of a community and a city issue. So our local state assembly member, Tasha Berner, drafted a state bill to better regulate or at least implement safety measures for youth e-bike riding. The bill failed in the state assembly a few years ago. And so our students took that on as an issue, and we do a yearly trip up to Sacramento with my Leadership Academy students, and we try to focus on an issue or two to really aim our advocacy at. And so when we met with different lawmakers up in Sacramento during that legislative season, it's around January, they were able to take that on and put that issue and that bill in front of those lawmakers. And so that bill was ultimately passed. And with those new safety measures in place, it was kind of the ideal issue to take on for our students because it is an issue that literally aimed at them and involving them. So the issue was very understandable and at home for them. But to be able to take that issue and actually get to walk it all the way through the legislative process, I thought that was pretty unique because obviously we don't control the legislative process and some bills pass, a lot of them don't. So to see when they actually get through with the backing, I think was very validating for them. But as I kept reminding them, like the learning point from my view is them understanding how that moves all the way through the process from start to finish, right? And all the different stakeholders involved, from community members, local city councils, our state legislature, different interest groups. That's all very valuable information for them.
That's really just a prime example, right, of how it's super student driven, but also just a way to get at the experience that students are passionate about, right? And you can tell, and they get to experience that firsthand. You mentioned your Leadership Academy. I'd love to learn more. You said it's specific to the upper school. Can you tell us a bit more about how that program differs than maybe the more holistic program across the school? And what was, I guess, the impetus to start that at Pacific Ridge?
Sure. So this civics work dovetailed well with the fact that our upper school was looking to launch an academy program where the upper school is going to host 3 separate academies: Global Academy, Service Learning Academy, and Civic Leadership Academy. And all 3 are opt-in programs for the students starting in the 9th grade. And the hope was the 3 different programs would provide in school, but really more out of school opportunities for students to go in depth in these subjects. And then, provided they meet the requirements for the different academies, whatever particular academy they're in, they would graduate in the 12th grade with a distinction on their diploma from that academy. So when I launched Civic Leadership Academy, my big hope was that I really wanted our students working with elected officials and in nonprofits outside of school. So again, the focus is really, this is not just one more class they're taking in the school. This is them doing something outside of the school in the subject matter area. So to slightly dip into my own experience, I had the great opportunity when I was in a senior year, going to senior year of college. That summer, I interned for the governor up in Sacramento here in California. And I learned so much more from that internship than I probably ever would have in most of my in-class classes, even though I was a poli-sci minor at UCLA. So I really wanted my students to have that same experience learning about civics firsthand. So we launched that, and last year was our first year. So my group of 9th graders, we did some in-school programming, kind of talking about civic issues, and I took them to Sacramento on that advocacy trip. But the best part about it, from my view, was that they were all able to set up with internships outside of school, where they then learned, obviously, a ton on the job about civics. So we had one student interning for our local member of Congress. We had 2 for our city council here in Carlsbad, 1 for the neighboring city of Encinitas. 1 even got to intern for a federal judge in downtown San Diego. So the Civic Leadership Academy tries to provide these opportunities for students to really go in depth in civics in a way that we really can't replicate just at school.
It's so nice to hear about the Leadership Academy. It's such a good opportunity, I think, for students to learn outside of the classroom. And it seems like such a key component of that model. But I also wonder if that lends itself to pretty varied experiences that might be hard to track. So I'm wondering, Spencer, can you tell us a little more about how you're assessing students in this model and kind of what serves as the evidence that you mentioned, they have the potential to get a distinction on their diplomas? Like, how are you tracking that? What does assessment look like in this particular model? Love to explore that with you.
Sure. So the intention behind the academy system is that in all of the 3 different academies, and we're just focusing on the Civic Leadership Academy, but in all the 3 different academies, there's a set of requirements the students do every year to fulfill that year. And then they do that all 4 years. They graduate with the distinction. The intention is not necessarily assessment in the context of like classroom assessment, how we would talk about it, but rather these should be a set of out of school experiences or really just out of the classroom experiences that they're doing. So for example, in the Civic Leadership Academy, every year, the students need to have either an internship with an elected official or engage in civics through speaking at a city council meeting or a commission meeting or something of the sort. So my hope is through those out of school experiences, that's where they're really getting the rich learning on that end. So they have their internship. Every year, I take a group of students up to Sacramento to advocate for a number of issues. And we always go during the quote unquote lobbying season, which is typically January through April, because that's when bills are being proposed and debated and discussed before they're voted on by the Assembly and the Senate. So we will head up to Sacramento, meet with our local Assembly members, and Assembly member Tasha Borner, who represents our district down here in San Diego, and then Assemblywoman Davies, who is also part of the district, and then our state senator, Catherine Blakespear, all made time to meet with our students and go through some of their priorities. And again, this is an out of school experience these students get to have in a very real world setting, right? This is what actual advocates and policy groups and anyone else who's going to a capital like Sacramento to advocate for, it's what they do. So between their internship and the Sacramento trip and a formal leadership academy, leadership training program we do at our school every year for all of our student leaders, co-curricular, student council, sports captains with our students. And on that, this collection of experiences in my mind is the content that they're getting out of this. And to kind of drive home those different points, we also meet at least once per trimester with the academy students to recap some of these experiences and make sense of what they've been doing so far and what they've been seeing, particularly in the internships, where, like you mentioned, the experiences can be very varied. And we had a great recap when we came back to school this August, because a lot of the students had their internships over the summer. So two different students with city council members, one with a congressperson, one with a federal judge, and having the students kind of unpack all the different things they saw, I thought that was very rich.
Yeah, I'm wondering too. I mean, it sounds like this program is fairly new. What have been some of the roadblocks that you've had to overcome in rolling out a newer program like this? And then also, where and how do you see it evolving for the future?
Well, you have to generate student interest at the beginning. So we started with kind of a small group, and as their classmates saw the kind of work that was happening, they got more interested, and it's kind of gained and gained and gained, which is kind of the trajectory that I would expect. I think an obvious roadblock is because a lot of these activities are outside of school, they have to make time for it. And we tried to be very transparent from the beginning. This is going to require a fair amount of responsibility and self-drive on your end, because we're not going to hold your hand through all these different pieces. Like, I'm here to help you land these internships, and I have connections with a lot of these offices, and I try to facilitate on that end. But similar to advice I'm sure you got early on in your career, like, you can have people help you get a job, and then you got to do the job. So now that you're here in the internship, you got to make something of it. And these are ninth graders we're talking about. So they're brand new to this entire scheme. Hearing their feedback and then also following up with some of the elected officials, like understanding how to perform at a job and show up on time. Like, these are all real world skills they're learning. And I think one of the overarching themes, and I don't know if I touched on this, but we're really trying to teach them like actual real world skills, specifically soft skills that now we hear more and more employers identifying with young adults coming out of college, entering the workforce, and these hiring managers sitting here saying they are very deficient in some very key soft skills: communication, doing this, writing, formal communication, all these things. A lot of things I hope to do with these students. And so we crafted their resumes together so they could apply for these internships. That Sacramento trip went through a lot of kind of the basics of more formal interactions. I thought one of the funniest ones is, one thing young adults and high schoolers cannot do to save their life today is shake someone's hand and look them at the eye at the same time and introduce yourself. It's off the table. And I do partly blame COVID, and it's not fair to blame COVID for everything. But I mean, that interaction itself not happening. And so as we were waiting in the airport to fly up to Sacramento, we practiced for a solid 10 minutes, shaking each other's hands and looking each other in the eye and saying their name. It sounds super basic, and it probably looks funny to everyone else in Southwest Terminal number 2. But when we got to Sacramento and they did that to the lawmakers were blown away. They're like, I've never seen a kid be able to do that. So little skills like that, I hope they do carry with it. And it's something that I think will serve them well, whatever they do after high school and into college and applying to actual jobs later down the road.
Absolutely. I love that you're teaching them both the hard skills and the soft skills needed to survive in this world. I'm just curious, like, have you been met with any sort of pushback in your community for doing this work around civic engagement? I mean, we live in such a polarized world. I'm not sure if that's come up at all as a roadblock as you've rolled out something that's kind of contentious these days, like on how civics education should be taught. Has that come up for you at all at Pacific Ridge?
These programs, as rolled out, have been very popular. And I think the reason why, and really the intention behind it, is my mantra this whole time, both to our community and to every other school I've talked about and helped them kind of form their programs, is you need to focus on local politics. And the reason why you need to focus on local politics is it's tangible to your community. It's down home. These are individuals who want to work with you. You're going to have an actual impact. And I think keeping that focus front and center, not all the way on national politics and everything we're seeing on social media and the news and all the other ugly things, I think that served us really well. And we've been able to use local politics as a springboard to then teach, or at least analogize, like what is happening on the national level and try to make sense of some of those issues. And as you can imagine, depending on what specific issue we're talking about, that can be totally across the board. But these programs as designed have been very popular. And I think the community does appreciate that we are connecting with all these different stakeholders in the communities. Like we're spanning a couple different cities, working with their city councils. We have our assembly members. So we're hitting all these different touch points. And I think if I was to give advice to other schools to maybe create something similar is, really cast a wide net. I give these students a lot of flexibility in who they want to work with, any side of the aisle. I would much prefer that we're talking about, we're not all interning for the same person or the same office. Like we're hitting a couple different areas. And I think that brings a lot more rich experience for the group as a whole to kind of recap on that end. But I think the other side of the coin, and maybe we were going to discuss this in a moment, if this was the Leadership Academy, the civics activities kind of in general, which more on a school-wide level that maybe could lend towards maybe some of the friction you were talking about. In addition to the focus on local politics, I think as you do delve into some other issues, and maybe more on a nationwide scale, giving credence to both ends. And by that, I mean specifically during last election season in 2024, like, the House of Representatives seats are up every 2 years. There's always an election for that. So for our congressional seat, I had both the candidates, the Republican and the Democrat, come speak to the students separately. And they were able to address them and kind of introduce themselves and talk about the campaign and their platform. And I do think if you're going to invite a candidate to school, and there are some very specific rules about what 501c3 nonprofits can engage in and the kind of interactions you can have, you need to invite both of them at the very least. And so we have a county supervisor seat coming up in the next election, and right now it's 2 Republicans and a Democrat for that seat. They're all going to come talk to the students, hopefully at some point this year, because they're all interested. But you're giving end to that. And I think that's not only the appropriate thing to do for the community, but it's also teaching students really important lessons in terms of you need to be able to respect someone's viewpoint. You don't have to agree with it and you don't have to be convinced. But again, this is one of the huge red flags we've heard kind of across the board, especially with young adults, is like the inability to have these conversations, or at least their discussions. And I think that starts at like a very base level with just hearing someone out, like not even engaging in the discussion yet, but having that. I like the fact that our students can hear from all these different speakers, some of which inevitably they will agree with, some that they won't, but to be able to sit there and have those interactions and then take that into, I think we're fortunate that we're a Harkness-based school. So our students are pretty well versed in discussion protocols and having these kind of discussions, but to take something from hearing these different speakers and different viewpoints into having their own discussions, I feel like that's kind of the progression that would most benefit the students. So knock on wood that the experience has been pretty positive so far. And, as far as working with different members of your community, like and this is one of my like larger pieces, but the old political saying is that all politics is local, right? I think it was Tip O'Neill that is usually coined with that. The reality today is that all politics are national. And I think a very big downside of that, we can all blame social media, and I think that is partly the blame, but one of the big downsides of that is that there's a number of Americans who will know more about some random controversy about a school board in Bethesda, Maryland, than they do who actually sits on their own school board, or something happened at a city council meeting in Boise, Idaho. They don't even know who's on their own city council. So, I mean, I feel like part of the disconnect we're having with politics run amok is that like we need to bring it back to the local level. And at the very least, you should understand what's happening in your community. You want to branch out further than that, that's great. But our focus on local, I think, has served us well so far.
Yeah, it's definitely a clear tenet that I'm hearing coming out with this particular program. Are there other kind of first steps that you'd recommend for schools looking to implement a similar program at their schools? You've talked about a few as far as like staying local and making sure you're hearing from a wide breadth of political perspectives. Anything else that you'd recommend for schools interested in doing something similar?
Sure. And I think, as with launching any new program, I think the first question should always be take a look at what we have so far and try to think, how can this program build on that or supplement it or take it a step further, rather than always being in the mindset of launching something brand new that then requires new things and so on and so forth. So I'll relate a conversation I had with a school leader back in Pittsburgh. We spoke this summer, and he'd heard a session that I put on about this whole leadership type training and programs that I did about a year ago for CSEE. And he was wondering, he's like, I want to make a leadership program at my school. And we're a high school program, so I'm kind of thinking on that end. And his concept is really doing a leadership class. And he wanted advice on, like, how do I form this up? And is there a curriculum? Is there this? And what our conversation kind of came back to is, after I related a lot of the same things I just told you, how our school is rolling out these different pieces, they already had kind of a leadership type, I'm not going to call it a program, but something they kind of had in the works, and the students were kind of familiar with this. And so our conversation turned to taking that program they had and then incorporating intentionally a lot more elements kind of in the leadership type vein we were talking about. And there was even some local community connections. So I thought that was a really good use of programs they already had in place that they're now enhancing or elevating to kind of reach that end goal. So if I was to give advice kind of generally for any school, after you take a look at what you have so far and figure, how can we build on it or enhance, then start thinking about community connections. And maybe your school has a really strong service learning program that has already been working with maybe some community partners that are close by. Maybe lean on them first. And maybe your leadership avenue is having the leaders of those nonprofits coming to school and talking about their work. And maybe that bends over towards now working with the city council on something that's kind of closely related. So it doesn't always have to be something that's already in the works, but I think it is much more effective and maybe easier to build on what you do have and some strengths that your school already leans on, trying to get this off the ground.
Yep. Makes sense, right? Leverage your strengths, build off what you have. I'm just curious, like, was it ever difficult to get a hold of your local Congress people, and like any strategies on that front to get them to come and engage with your students?
For sure. At NAIS Thrive last year, I presented a session where we were talking about this, about advocacy and how to work with your lawmakers and so on and so forth. And something I had learned when I worked for the governor is there are some very specific channels to go through to outreach with your lawmakers, but they generally do want to work with you. And so, for example, to reach out to your Congress member, you can pull this up. All of this should be online, but your Congress members should have field offices, right? Like it shows their contact page. There'll be like the DC office, but let's say your school is in New York, they're going to have field offices spread out as well. So contact the field offices first, because you're a lot more likely to get a response. And if you just make another call to DC, they'll usually list a couple of contact modes: email, phone. Do each of them a couple times, and it might take you a couple swings to finally get a hold of somebody. But when you do, all those offices have people there where their job is to be a community rep. And like their job is to literally do events you're talking about, go to your school. At this point, I've had the community reps like judge my business competitions and come speak at assemblies. Like, they love kind of doing those things because they're supposed to be involved in the community. So I always tell schools and people trying to get into this work that I would really view these interactions with the lawmakers as a two-way street. And it's not just you making an ask. I would like Congressperson so-and-so to speak on one day. Like, maybe that's the end goal, but you're helping their office as well, right? If my ask is, I would like the community reps to come and talk with the students, we're going to work on this issue. And for example, this year we're focusing on the Tijuana River crisis, like whatever the issue is. If that's my end, their offices also usually have some asks. So whenever I make my ask, my second question is always like, what do you need help with right now? And oftentimes there is a priority or two or three. They're trying to build support for funding on a new like rail measure or something that they could actually use students kind of getting behind that and helping out. So the more that you start to build that two-way, the much better connection is going to be with your school. And then when you do have an ask, like the election's coming up, and I would love for, in the middle of their busy campaign, congressperson so-and-so to come speak to the students, like you're much more likely to get a positive response. And especially once those elected officials have gotten comfortable with your school, where it's somewhere where they know that it's going to be a good experience and have a good discussion with the students, I think that all kind of adds up. So start with the local field offices, be persistent. Once you start building those connections, nurture those connections and see if you can't help them as well.
Yeah, and what I love about that too is that when you said it goes both ways. It's not only that you have an ask, right, of those representatives, but that they're coming to you with what they need. And I think that is really helpful to get that student input, right? It probably makes your students feel that much more valued and that their voice is being heard as well, right, when it comes to that perspective. So that's wonderful. I'm going to bring us up a little bit, Spencer. I'd love to hear just kind of broadly, where do you go for inspiration when it comes to this equity and civic engagement work? Is there anything you're listening to or reading or any really good advice you've ever been given when it comes to engaging in this work and moving it forward?
It's an excellent question. On the academic side, I'm teaching AP US government and politics this year. And so I'm kind of living in this world on both ends, maybe the more active side with the academy and the academic side with the class. And so kind of being immersed in these, I think a benefit of a study like this is like there is always new things coming up to talk about and analyze and unpack. And I think one of the more interesting aspects of it is you can kind of let those current events drive where this is going, right? Like I'll try to come in with a game plan. Like, for example, when we're talking about the election last year, there were some events I already had slotted in. The congressional candidates were to come speak. We're going to have the student mock election, but then other stuff just came up. We had interest from the community in having a ballot primer session to educate mainly the adults on, you've seen your ballot all the way down. You'll recognize a couple names at the top, and you're getting all the way down to measure HHH, approving whatever for whatever. It's confusing, and a lot of adults don't quite know. So we had our local Chamber of Commerce CEO come and actually put on a session for the adults after school, and my econ students came and heard about the econ end. So letting those current events kind of drive you on that end. In terms of, you asked for different sources for inspiration. I think same advice I give the students. I think it's important to read pretty widely. And of course, especially in the age of podcasts and some people claiming we're post-literate, I believe that, the reading is important. So as much as I can, at least browse each morning. We have school subscriptions to New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Take a look at both of those. San Diego Union Tribune is our local paper. So in reading those, I think you're going to see some interesting parts, kind of like I tell the students. A lot of the news is reported similar, but you go to the editorial page, like they're going to have different slants. And I think it's important to read those kind of different opinions. You can start to kind of see for yourself how different people might frame a similar issue. In terms of podcasts, it's so across the board. We're literally recording for a podcast right now. So same thing. I think podcasts where it's not just one person talking and kind of giving their views, but like having interesting conversations. And some of the better podcasts today, I think, really make an effort to bring on these different people and talk. And I love that because now you actually hear a conversation, especially if you can get two people of different viewpoints, like they're going to start going back and forth and you can parse different pieces out. So I think all of that is relevant. I think as we go into the next election season, 2026, new issues are going to come up, new things are going to happen. That's more for us to unpack. I had the good fortune last summer of spending a week at the Supreme Court with Street Law, is a group that does a summer institute for teachers in conjunction with Supreme Court Historical Society. And we did a deep dive into everything Supreme Court case law and the way the court works, literally right there at the court. And we got to sit on one of the sessions. And so I put on a session for our faculty beginning of this year talking about the upcoming term for the court, the one that just ended, which again, new cases, new things will come up. The October term just started for this new court term. So it's a very roundabout way of answering your question, that I kind of like let the current events dictate where we're going. And again, a skill that I hope the students are getting is like, we're trying to teach them these concrete skills, critical analysis, close reading, communication. The issues are always going to change. And I think another skill you have to have, this may be a little more tangible, is just being flexible and adaptable and being able to take a new thing that comes in, make sense of it, be able to do something with it. The common saying, like we tell our juniors are doing career exploration, career fair type stuff, the skills you need for tomorrow have not been invented yet. So one of the best skills you can have is just this flexibility and ability to learn, I think, is paramount.
Yeah. Like you said, current events, right, are always going to be driving what's top of mind for you and your students, but also let's go back to basics and really push reading. My final question for you today is just if you could pinpoint, one of your greatest achievements, could you share one with our listeners today?
Greatest achievement. Well, I think being able to carry forward a program like this Civic Leadership Academy, like you mentioned, in a very polarized environment where understandably many educators and schools are running the complete opposite direction from this kind of work. I think that's my greatest achievement right now.
Well, kudos to you. Kudos to Pacific Ridge. It sounds like you've created a really impactful and engaging program for students, and I'm so thankful that you got to share it with our listeners today. Thanks so much, Spencer.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to NAIS Member Voices. You can find some related NAIS resources from this episode by visiting nais.org/member voices. You can also keep an eye on that page for information about past and upcoming episodes. Please be sure to subscribe to Member Voices wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode, and go back and listen to previous episodes you might have missed. If you have feedback for us, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to let us know how we're doing. You can also send us your thoughts and suggestions on what you'd like to hear on a future podcast by emailing membership@nais.org.